The first signs of spring in St. Mary Mead arrived not in grand displays but in the smallest of awakenings. Green shoots pushing their way through the dark soil, birds fussing over nest twigs beneath the eaves, and a slight softness in the air that even Miss Marple's rheumatic hands could feel as she pruned her rose bushes. From her vantage point beside the stone wall, she had a quiet view of the lane that wound past the vicarage and curved up toward Weatherby Cottage, long empty and sun-faded. It had stood vacant since Mrs. Weatherby's passing, and many in the village had grown used to seeing its windows blank and curtains drawn. That morning, however, Miss Marple observed something new. A furniture lorry arrived, modest, no more than 4 men unloading, and shortly thereafter, a tall gray-haired gentleman appeared, guiding the men with efficient gestures but few words. She paused with her secateurs in mid-air, watching with mild interest. There was no grand welcome, no calling cards left at the vicarage or post office. The man entered the house and did not re-emerge. Later, she noticed a pair of worn gardening boots left on the back step, and the faint scent of bonfire smoke drifting on the breeze. Something had settled into Weatherby Cottage once more, but not quite comfortably. Mr. Percival Gage, as he was eventually identified by the grocer's delivery invoice, was not a man to seek company. He nodded politely when spoken to, but rarely offered more than a clipped "good morning." He ordered milk, bread, and newspapers, and never collected them himself, instead waving from behind his low privet hedge. Mrs. Petherbridge at the drapery said she'd seen him staring at the church notice board for nearly 10 minutes, one Tuesday, as though reading a language no one else could see. He spent long hours in the garden, cutting back the old brambles and arranging stones in curious deliberate rows. It was not that he was unfriendly. He simply seemed elsewhere. It was Lily Wren, the vicar's bright-eyed housemaid, who found it first. She had been sent with a note from Mrs. Tattinger and, as she often did, took the shortcut along the garden hedge beside Weatherby Cottage. The sun was warm, and she was humming to herself when something glinted at her from the grass. Nestled awkwardly in an old rubber boot, one of a pair always stationed near the hedge, was a man's pocket watch. It was silver, scuffed at the edges, and not ticking. Curious, she knelt and turned it over. The back bore initials, P.G. The boots had always been there, she told the vicar's wife later, but she'd never seen anything inside them before. It was scarcely 2 hours after Lily's find that the alarm was raised. Mr. Gage had not come in to sign for the newspaper, and the delivery boy, bold with adolescent impatience, had wandered round the side garden to tap at the rear window. There, amid the foxgloves, lay Mr. Gage. He was sprawled awkwardly, as though he had tried to sit and failed. One hand rested beside a trowel, and his eyes, open but unfocused, stared through the tremulous stalks of flowers swaying above him. Dr. Weatherby, no relation to the original owners of the house, was summoned promptly. He examined the scene with clinical calm and made no hasty pronouncements. There was no wound, no evidence of a fall, but there was a faint, sweet smell in the air that did not come from foxglove or lilac. Bitter almonds, the doctor murmured later. And Miss Marple, who had once read a curious piece on garden poisons in a back issue of The Lady, pressed her lips together and said nothing. News traveled quickly in St. Mary Mead, and it was not long before tea was being poured with slightly trembling hands at the vicarage, and theories began their gentle climb from speculation to scandal. But Miss Marple, seated in her usual armchair beneath the window, was not drawn into the swirl. She asked instead, quite mildly, about Lily's discovery, the watch in the boot. Had anyone remarked on the boots before? Had their position ever changed? Lily, surprised, said no. They were always there, just by the hydrangeas, pointing slightly inward. But the left one had fallen over that morning, and that's when she noticed the watch. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. One seldom puts anything of value inside a boot. Later that evening, when others dwelled on poison and death, Miss Marple thought of timepieces, and how they marked not just hours, but intentions. A man does not hide a watch in a garden boot by accident, and she knew, from long acquaintance with human nature, that when something ends oddly, it has likely begun so too. She folded her knitting and looked toward the darkening lane. Weatherby Cottage had gone quiet again, but this time, unnaturally so. The vicarage drawing-room was unusually full for a weekday. A soft rain tapped at the windows, and within, a fire crackled modestly beneath a framed embroidery of the Beatitudes. Tea was poured with a steadiness that belied the current of unease running through the room. "Such a peculiar end," murmured Mrs. Petherbridge, gently spreading gooseberry jam on her scone. "And to think it happened in the foxgloves." The talk had shifted, inevitably, from preserves and parish notices to the strange and sudden death of Mr. Percival Gage. Conversation tiptoed around the subject at first, but curiosity proved stronger than manners. "I always thought him rather detached," said Mr. Reeves, the church organist, adjusting his spectacles. "There was something not quite settled in him. Never once stayed through the full service. Slipped out after the Psalms, he did." The group murmured their assent. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in the corner with pale blue wool, looked up once or twice, but offered nothing more than a small, polite smile. "He kept to himself, that's true," said Mrs. Price, reaching for another sandwich. "But did you hear? The doctor suspects poison. Cyanide, they say. Frightful." The talk turned somber. The room, though warm, seemed to cool a degree. Miss Marple added 3 more careful stitches and looked at no one in particular. She had heard what she needed, not in the words but in the eagerness with which they'd been said. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to Edwin Marsh. "Poor fellow," sighed Mrs. Price, as if preemptively absolving herself of the accusation that followed. "But he was never quite right, was he?" There was a pause. Then Mrs. Petherbridge nodded solemnly. "He served, you know. North Africa. Came back with a terrible tremor in the hand. Couldn't hold a teacup properly without rattling the saucer. And a temper," added Mr. Reeves. "He snapped at young Johnny Webber in the post office just last month. Over something trifling. A cue, I think." No one had seen Edwin since the morning of the death. His curtains at Weatherby Cottage remained drawn. "He was living with Mr. Gage, wasn't he?" said a young woman near the hearth. "Must have been difficult. 2 quiet men in one house. No one to balance the atmosphere." Miss Marple did not speak, but she recalled a certain Sunday some weeks ago. Edwin, standing just outside the lich gate, had stared down the path for nearly 5 minutes after service, not moving, just watching the graveyard. He had not spoken to anyone that day. "A man can carry many things back from war," she said at last, setting down her knitting. "Not all of them visible." The silence that followed was not unkind, but it was heavy. "I say," said Mr. Reeves after a long silence, "did no one else see that woman?" There was a brief flurry of exchanged glances. Mrs. Petherbridge nodded. "Yes. Slim, well-dressed. Gloves and a lilac scarf, I think. I saw her coming down the lane near the post office just last Tuesday. Thought she must have been visiting Mr. Gage. I saw her twice," added Mrs. Price. "Once in February, once last month. She always left in a bit of a hurry. Strange that. He never mentioned her. Maybe she didn't come to see him," someone muttered. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly. A woman's presence was always noticed in St. Mary Mead, particularly one who didn't linger. That she came and went without introduction was unusual, but not impossible. Some people preferred the shadows. "Did anyone ever see her arrive?" she asked softly. No one answered. That too was telling. Later that afternoon, the pocket watch reappeared. It had been taken in by Sergeant Coombs, who had given it to the local constable for safekeeping. News traveled quickly, as it does in villages. It was an old silver piece, cracked along the casing, and inscribed with the initials PG, undoubtedly Mr. Gage's. But the peculiar detail, remarked upon by more than one, was the time it displayed. 3:10, said Dr. Weatherby, "which makes no sense. He was found just before noon." The vicar's wife had it from the constable's sister that the watch had not stopped recently. It had not ticked for quite some time. "A watch that doesn't tick is no use to anyone," said Mrs. Petherbridge. Miss Marple thought otherwise. A broken watch may serve no practical purpose, but it might yet tell a story about a moment someone wanted to preserve, or perhaps one they could not bear to forget. The matter of the boot was scarcely discussed, except by Lily, who remained quietly troubled by the way it had toppled. "It was always upright," she told the vicar's wife, "always near the hydrangeas, just to the side. Both boots. They'd been there since the autumn. But that morning the left one had fallen over, and that's how I saw the watch." Miss Marple, listening as she patted the dog's head, made no comment, but she filed the detail carefully. Boots that stood unchanged for months did not fall on their own, nor did people absent-mindedly tuck timepieces into rubber soles. And the placement, near the hydrangeas, not the back door or potting bench. Why there? And why always the same spot? It was not her habit to speculate aloud. But Miss Marple had known many gardens, and in gardens the things left undisturbed were often those most intentionally placed. The next morning Miss Marple happened upon Mrs. Clemens outside the churchyard, sorting through hymn sheets for the Easter service. A quiet woman, formerly a schoolmistress, she had the unblinking eyes of one accustomed to noticing more than she spoke. "I knew Mr. Gage long ago," she said, unprompted. "His sister and I were school friends before the war. That house was always peculiar, even when they were children." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging with silence. "He was a collector," Mrs. Clemens added, almost absently. "Even then. Clocks, I believe, always tinkering, fixing and stopping them. He used to say time didn't behave unless you gave it boundaries." Her hand trembled slightly as she passed Miss Marple a hymnal. It was not the grief of someone shocked by death. It was something older, something worn. As Miss Marple walked away, she thought not of clocks, but of fear. Fear not of a man's death, but of what might now come into the light. And fear, she had often observed, rarely belonged to those with nothing to hide. It was over tea at the church sewing circle that Miss Marple first heard mention of Mr. Gage's sister. Mrs. Pendle, who had once worked as a junior secretary for the War Office, recalled the name faintly from a casualty list. "Eleanor Gage," she said, her voice tinged with the hesitation of memory. "Lost in 1940, somewhere near Dieppe, one of those early transports. Dreadful business, really. No body ever found." Miss Marple looked down at her embroidery frame. "And Mr. Marsh?" she asked softly. "Oh, they were engaged, poor lambs," Mrs. Pendle replied. "Young Edwin Marsh and Miss Eleanor. Everyone expected it. Then came the telegram. He changed after that, left the village entirely for a time. It was a quiet sort of grief, Miss Marple thought, the kind that wore a man down not by bursts of sorrow, but by the long erosion of what might have been. Later that week she asked at the post office casually about a parcel Mr. Gage had once sent to a Miss Clara something. The postmistress, who never forgot handwriting, noted that the script had been almost identical to old letters addressed to Eleanor. Some losses, Miss Marple mused, did not dissipate with time. They simply changed shape and followed one into silence. The connection between Gage and Edwin had always puzzled the village. Lodger and landlord, yes, but there was something else, something unspoken and unresolved. At the grocer's, Mr. Hamley shared that he had once seen them sitting outside the cottage on a cold evening, not speaking, merely staring at the garden. "Like two men waiting for something to arrive," he said, though neither looked as though they wanted it to. Others recalled that Edwin had taken to sleeping in the shed for a spell, even though there was a perfectly fine guest room indoors. No one asked why. When Edwin's name was spoken, it was with pity first and unease second. He was not disliked, only misunderstood. Miss Marple considered the two men as figures in a delicate arrangement, bound by a shared wound, kept apart by the inability to speak its name aloud. It was Mrs. Talbot, recently widowed and newly inclined to conversation, who gave Miss Marple the next sliver of insight. She had visited Mr. Gage once, under the pretext of selling church raffle tickets. He invited her in, which surprised her, and offered tea in a parlor of curious stillness. "There were clocks," she whispered, eyes lowered, "all of them old, all stopped, each at exactly 3:10. Miss Marple, who had heard of the time on the broken pocket watch, said nothing. "He set something peculiar," Mrs. Talbot continued. "Some hours should not be restarted." Then he smiled, and it was the sort of smile that makes one finish her tea quickly. To stop time, Miss Marple thought, is not within our gift, but to pretend, to arrange symbols of stillness. That is entirely human, especially when the hour itself holds meaning. A visiting nurse, Miss Carrick, was next to speak, quietly over eggs at the Saturday market. She had looked in on Mr. Gage once or twice when he'd taken a bad turn with his back. "He was always polite," she said, "but twitchy, always listening. And the house. It was like stepping into someone else's memory. There were cabinets full of faded letters, bits of ribbon, a broken pair of spectacles wrapped in silk. She'd seen maps torn and refolded, and war medals polished to excess. He had the air, she added, of a man preparing for something to return, but not knowing when or in what form. She'd tried once to move a pile of items from the side table to dust beneath, but he'd reacted oddly. "Don't disturb that," he'd said, low and sharp. "It's all arranged." Grief, Miss Marple reflected, can take on a curator's hand, arranging fragments of the past into exhibits no one else is meant to see. The garden at Weatherby Cottage, though modest, had become oddly compartmentalized in recent months. Neighbors noted that Mr. Gage worked only one side of it, never venturing beyond the narrow path that led from the back steps to the rose bush. "I saw him once, standing at the path's edge at dusk," Mr. Reeves mentioned at the choir practice. "He just stared down toward the hydrangeas, wouldn't set foot past them." The boots remained by the hedge, untouched. Once Lily had tried to move them while helping deliver groceries, but he had stopped her with a firm, almost frightened tone. "They're fine where they are," he'd said. "Leave them be." Miss Marple thought again of the boot and of the pocket watch found inside. To others a simple oddity, to her a deliberate placement, ritualistic perhaps, or meant to conceal. There is, she mused, a language in where people walk, and where they refuse to tread. At the vicarage gate one morning, Miss Marple paused to adjust the string of her basket. Mrs. Price, passing with her spaniel, stopped too, eager to share a thought that had clearly been brewing. "Don't you think," she began in a conspiratorial whisper, "that Mr. Gage was expecting something to happen?" Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "I mean, he was afraid, not just eccentric, always looking over his shoulder, jumped at sudden sounds. That business with the clocks, it wasn't just mourning, it was anticipation." She hesitated. "Or dread?" The idea lingered. Had Mr. Gage become prisoner to his own mind? Or had something, or someone, given him cause to fear his past might resurface? Miss Marple offered no reassurance. She simply nodded and continued her walk, her thoughts quietly aligning. In her long life she had learned that fear, like grief, leaves a pattern. And when a pattern repeats, especially around garden boots and stopped watches, something deliberate has taken root. Miss Marple, on the pretext of reviewing an old boundary dispute regarding her niece's allotment, paid a visit to Mr. Cranley, the village solicitor. His office, always faintly smelling of beeswax and tobacco, had not changed in years. "I wonder," she said mildly, "if Mr. Gage had cause to revise any documents before his passing. One hears things, of course, but land can be so very symbolic." Mr. Cranley, a cautious man but not immune to gentle flattery, nodded. "He did, as it happens, not long ago. Came in with a sealed envelope, quite formal, all above board." "And did he name anyone unexpected?" "A woman, actually. Unusual given his solitude. A Clara Glemson." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Glemson. That's not a saint. Mary Mead name, is it?" "Never crossed my desk before. No local address, only a London forwarding service. But he was very firm about it." Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts already turning. Clara, a name that echoed faintly in the folds of memory, like the sound of a door shutting at the far end of a corridor. At the post office, the next layer of mystery emerged. Miss Marple, under the pretext of posting some preserves to a distant cousin, lingered at the counter long enough to glance through the outgoing registry. "Oh, those again," sighed Miss Harriet, the postmistress, pointing to a small pile of receipts. "Mr. Gage's parcels, always to Clara, always care of odd locations, hostels, forwarding depots, one even to a theatrical agency. Never the same place twice." "Strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple offered lightly. "One would think a friend deserving of inheritance would also be worthy of a proper address." Miss Harriet snorted softly. "That's not how some people operate, Miss Marple. There are women, pardon the term, who like not to be found." "Indeed." But Miss Marple's mind returned to the strange formality of Gage's will. If Clara were someone indecent, the gift would be made quietly, unofficially. But he had insisted on putting it in writing, legal, binding and oddly affectionate in its tone, as Cranley had let slip. It was the care, not the secrecy, that puzzled her. Clara mattered, but Clara, it seemed, did not want to exist. Over the course of several days, Miss Marple made her customary rounds with quiet purpose. She asked no direct questions, merely dropped the name Clara into conversation. At the butcher's, during a service at the church, even in passing with the vicar's wife, not once did the name stir recognition, not even a flicker. "She doesn't teach at the school," said Mrs. Price, "and she's certainly not in the choir." "No such name on the women's auxiliary list," added Mrs. Petherbridge. Miss Marple smiled and said nothing more. If Clara Glemson had once been a real presence in St. Mary Mead, she had been thoroughly erased from communal memory. And yet the emotional gravity behind Mr. Gage's arrangements could not be denied. Names, Miss Marple knew, were rarely the true mystery. It was what they once covered, and whom they no longer concealed, that mattered most. It was just after twilight when Lily Wren, returning from the vicarage with a borrowed hymn book, glanced toward Weatherby Cottage and saw Edwin Marsh by the compost heap. A small fire was burning, controlled but oddly fierce. Edwin stood with his back to her, feeding papers into the flames, not carelessly but with an unsettling focus. He did not look up. Lily, troubled, mentioned it at breakfast the next morning. The vicar's wife relayed the account to Miss Marple over tea, her tone touched with anxiety. "He's not well, Jane. That's obvious to all of us. But this secrecy, burning things at night, it unsettles the servants." Miss Marple sipped quietly. "Sometimes," she said, "the act of destruction is the only way a man feels he still has power, especially if what he's burning has been haunting him." It wasn't guilt that Miss Marple saw in Edwin's imagined silhouette. It was fear. And fear, she thought, does not burn what it owns. It burns what it cannot bear to possess. 2 days later, a commotion rose behind the hedges. Mr. Crane's boy had been delivering potatoes when he caught Edwin digging furiously near the hydrangeas. In his hand, another pocket watch, cracked, tarnished, its chain still half buried in soil. He clutched it tightly, as if it might vanish again. When Miss Marple later spoke to the boy, he mimicked Edwin's words. He said it wasn't done hiding yet. Then he laughed. Just once, not like a joke, more like a cough, really. Constable Burrows took the watch, not knowing what to make of it. Miss Marple asked to see it. With a nod he passed it over. Inside the cracked face, on a scrap of paper curled like a ribbon, one line, in faint pencil. "Time kept for Clara." She returned the watch with a calm expression, but her mind began to arrange its own patterns. Clara was no longer a fiction. She had a time, and now a place, beneath the hydrangeas, beside the boot. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the chapel spire and the first scent of cut grass drifted in from the green, Miss Marple sat, with her knitting, untouched. Her thoughts turned instead to watches that no longer ticked. Her man who feared to enter his own garden, a name no one dared recall, letters buried beneath blossoms. Time for some is a sequence, for others a sanctuary. But for a few, for those burdened by memory or by guilt, it becomes a prison. Mr. Gage had not simply remembered Clara, he had preserved her, in objects, in arrangements, in broken timepieces too sentimental to throw away. It was not madness, Miss Marple thought. It was loyalty, carried far beyond the reasonable. He had hidden moments like others hide heirlooms. Only his were never meant for light. But light had come, as it always must. and what lay beneath it would not remain buried forever. It was Constable Burrows, red-faced and proud beneath his helmet, who delivered the news. Edwin Marsh had been arrested. The word traveled quickly from the constable's wife to the postmistress, and from there to the church flower committee, arriving at Miss Marple's ears with all the solemn finality of a Sunday bell. Cyanide, they said, ordered under his own name, from a supplier in Basingstoke, and delivered by hand just a week prior. His reason? To deal with moles in the lower garden. Mrs. Petherbridge shook her head gravely as she related. Rather foolish of him, really. Buying poison when one's housemate ends up dead? What did he expect? Perhaps he expected someone to ask why the moles were so urgent in April. Miss Marple said quietly, though no one paid it much mind. The relief among villagers was palpable. A suspect meant stability, a narrative to cling to. Edwin had always been peculiar, and in the minds of many, the story now resolved itself. Only Miss Marple sat in stillness that evening, her knitting untouched, the quiet words of Mr. Gage echoing in her memory. Some hours should not be restarted. There were too many pieces out of place, and none of them pointed convincingly at Edwin. Miss Marple took her usual afternoon walk past the allotments, and stopped to admire Mr. Cranley's early peas, though she barely saw them. Cyanide for moles. It had been offered as an explanation so easily. Yet Miss Marple, who had gardened through every season of her long life, knew April brought damp earth and new shoots. But not moles. They came later, in dry spells, when the soil cracked. She thought of the boots again, always by the hydrangeas, never moved, the second watch buried beside them, and Mr. Gage, who refused to walk past a particular patch of earth. Edwin's nervousness, his trembling hands and haunted eyes, these were not traits of a poisoner. They were, rather, the markings of a man who feared discovery, not of a crime but of something darker, the resurfacing of grief. The village was content to close the door. Miss Marple, however, knew the house was still full of shadows. It was Mrs. Price who brought the news of the letter. She had stopped by Mrs. Clemens's cottage to return a hymn book, and found her neighbor pale and unsettled, a crumpled piece of paper on the window-sill. One sentence, Mrs. Price whispered to the vicar's wife, who repeated it later to Miss Marple. You buried the truth under the rhododendrons. The words chilled her, not because they were dramatic, but because they were so precise. Miss Marple, when she heard, closed her sewing basket with a soft snap, a direct threat but veiled in symbolism. Whoever sent it knew what the hydrangeas, and perhaps the boots beside them, truly meant. Mrs. Clemens, usually composed and curt, had been visibly shaken, not weeping, but brittle in her movements, her hands clumsy with teacups. She denied knowing the letter's origin, denied knowing Clara, denied, Miss Marple noted, just a little too much. The next morning the news spread again. Mrs. Clemens had been found at the foot of her cellar steps. Lily Wren discovered her while delivering milk, unconscious but breathing, one wrist badly twisted, a bruise rising along her temple. The doctor was summoned, and while he insisted it had likely been an accident, no one seemed convinced. She's not a careless woman, said Mrs. Price. Always closes her cellar door. Always. The speculation began again, but this time the edges were sharper. Some hinted at suicide, others at retaliation. A few said the letter had pushed her too far. Miss Marple visited that afternoon and sat briefly by the bed. Mrs. Clemens was pale, lucid, and oddly silent. Her eyes did not meet Miss Marple's. "There was a letter," Miss Marple said gently. "And now this." Mrs. Clemens turned away. "The steps were wet," she said. "That's all." But her voice lacked conviction, and her hands, folded tightly in her lap, trembled ever so slightly. Miss Marple left without pressing further. The truth, she thought, had stirred, and someone had tried to stamp it out. The hydrangeas were blooming early that year. Miss Marple noticed the unnatural looseness of the soil around them as she passed by Weatherby Cottage on her next walk. The boots remained, but the ground beneath them had been recently disturbed, not by accident. A gardener's trowel had been used, not expertly but deliberately. She bent under pretext of tying her shoe and brushed a few petals aside. The earth was uneven, as though something once buried had been removed, or replaced. The second watch had come from here. She was certain of it. The soil still bore the imprint of its absence. And perhaps, Miss Marple thought, something else remained, some detail overlooked in haste. The garden had its own memory, and unlike people, it did not conceal unease. With Edwin in custody and no further incidents, St. Mary Mead settled into a tense quietude. It was the stillness of unresolved things, like the air before a summer storm. Gossip cooled into silence, and the villagers resumed their routines with polite distraction. But there was a weight to their movements, a carefulness in tone. No one spoke of Mr. Gage anymore, not aloud. Only Miss Marple remained distinctly alert. The pieces did not fit. Edwin's fear, Mrs. Clemens's fall, the watches, the buried messages, and Clara, always Clara, like a shadow in the margins of every conversation. Someone had shaped this story too neatly. Poison, motive, suspect, all tied up for village comfort. But Miss Marple knew life was rarely so obliging. The truth was still in the garden somewhere between the roots and the ghosts, and she had learned long ago that when no one else will listen, flowers will. Miss Marple presented herself at the vestry under the gentle guise of tidying baptismal records, something she had done before during various church projects. Reverend Fortescue, grateful for the help, gave her the keys without question. She moved through the ledgers slowly, unhurriedly, until she reached the 1925 entries. There it was. Clara Winifred Clemens, daughter of Margaret Clemens, schoolmistress, and Walter Clemens, deceased. The child had been baptized in the spring of that year. The handwriting was firm, the ink faded, but legible. Miss Marple turned the page and found no record of a death or removal. The next entry was for a harvest donation in 1939. Then nothing. Yet Mrs. Clemens had never spoken of children, not in the decades Miss Marple had known her. No mention, no photographs, no wistful phrases overheard at market or fete. Only silence, efficiently maintained. It was not conclusive, but it was suggestive. And in Miss Marple's experience, silence was not merely absence. It was arrangement, carefully built, like the placement of boots beside a hedge, undisturbed for years. At the schoolhouse, Miss Marple asked after some old wartime prize books. She had an interest in seeing the handwriting of the children from the early years. A perfectly innocuous request, given her standing. Miss Carter, the head mistress, obligingly brought out a dust-covered logbook, and there she was again. Clara W. Clemens, listed under top marks for literature in 1939. Noted as bright, quiet, good at dictation. The entries ended abruptly in May of 1940, marked relocation, unconfirmed. She was said to have died in an air raid. Miss Carter said with mild uncertainty. London, I think. But no one ever spoke about it directly. Her mother returned to work, didn't she? After only a few weeks. Miss Marple gently touched the faded page. A girl removed from record, like a phrase erased in ink and overwritten with years. But memory, she thought, leaves traces even where paper does not. And someone had gone to some trouble to prevent Clara's name from rising again. That evening Miss Marple requested to borrow a hymnal from the vicarage. The vicar's wife directed her to the storage cupboard behind the lectern. Miss Marple chose the oldest volume, fraying leather, a faint scent of lavender and ink. She turned the pages gently, her fingers pausing at psalms. A slip of folded music paper protruded just slightly from the gutter between. Pages 198 and 199. It had been there long enough to yellow at the edges. She drew it out and opened it carefully. The writing was faint, but legible. Clara is not lost. Clara lives. The name is not hers, but the hour remains. 3:10. There was no signature, but the handwriting was identical to that on the envelope Mr. Gage had deposited with the solicitor. Miss Marple closed the hymnal and returned it to the shelf. So Clara had not died, but fled. And Gage had helped her stay gone, marking her trail with time, not names. The hour, the watches, all fixed at 3:10. A time chosen deliberately, not of death, but of preservation. The next morning Miss Marple took the bus to Much Benham. There, tucked beside a tea room in an antique shop, stood the small dimly lit watchmaker's workshop of Mr. Daltrey. She entered quietly and waited until he looked up. "I'm helping tidy the belongings of Mr. Percival Gage," she said mildly. "We found a broken timepiece with the initials CG and thought perhaps you might know its origin." He adjusted his glasses and flipped through his ledger. "Yes, brought in last autumn. A lady's silver watch, cracked face, stopped at 3:10. She said not to fix the time, only the glass. She signed the receipt, Clara Glemson, wore gloves, very particular, paid in exact change." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And she never returned for it?" "No, madam. Said it was for someone else." Outside, the wind stirred the poppies in a florist's bucket. Miss Marple stood for a moment, quietly collecting the shape of things. Clara was real, alive, and moving under a name built from fragments of the past. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple mentioned Clara's surname, Glemson, to Reverend Fortescue during a routine discussion of parish newsletter fonts. He blinked. Strange coincidence. Percival Gage once published a brief theological piece under that name. During the war. I found it tucked into an old journal in the vestry. Can't think why he used a pseudonym for such mild commentary." Miss Marple smiled. Perhaps it wasn't meant to conceal anything theological, but something more personal. She asked to see the piece. It was unsigned but credited to PGG, likely Percival Gage Glemson, a composite, as Clara had fashioned hers. A shared surname, perhaps chosen, perhaps claimed. The article had little substance, a reflection on the nature of time, eternity, and the obligation to protect the soul in crisis. Miss Marple folded the journal gently. It was not theology, she thought. It was confession, hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple walked the long way home through the churchyard, and paused by the stone wall dividing it from the back gardens of Wetherby Cottage. The hydrangeas bowed in the breeze. The boots still stood beside them, empty, but somehow watchful. The facts now had taken shape. Clara had vanished under a new name, with Mr. Gage as her sole confidant and keeper of her secret. Time had become their shared cipher, a private language of hour and place. Mrs. Clemens had chosen silence, not only to protect Clara, but perhaps also herself, from shame, from questions, from the burden of recognition. 2 names changed, 2 identities buried beneath the surface of ordinary village life, and a garden filled with symbols arranged not by madness, but by memory. Miss Marple bent slightly to pluck a stray petal from the path. People vanish, she thought, but their intentions remain, if one knows where to look. The drawing room of the vicarage was quiet but charged, the kind of hush that falls not from reverence but anticipation. Miss Marple had invited only those who most needed to hear the truth. The vicar sat with folded hands and a furrowed brow. Beside him, the doctor, who had agreed to attend more out of curiosity than conviction. Edwin Marsh stood apart, still gaunt, still pale, but no longer hollow with fear. Mrs. Clemens sat very straight in the high-backed chair, her fingers interlaced in her lap, her face composed but tight at the corners. Miss Marple took her seat without ceremony, knitting in her lap untouched. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "There are things which ought not to be whispered, but calmly set in order." No one spoke. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the pause. "I believe Mr. Gage's death was not madness, nor misadventure," she said softly. "It was a consequence, tragic and avoidable, of a secret too long buried, and the weight of silence borne too well." Miss Marple folded her hands gently, her eyes resting on no one in particular. "Mr. Gage, as many of you know, was not a man of casual habits. What appeared to others as eccentricity was, in truth, devotion, directed toward the memory and safety of someone he called Clara." She glanced briefly at Mrs. Clemens, who stared at the fireplace. The boots in the garden, always in the same place, were not forgotten clutter. They were shrines. Mr. Gage hid things in them. Watches, stopped all at 3:10, each containing fragments of Clara's story, notes, initials, a key, all coded to a time of emotional stillness, the hour he chose to preserve. The doctor shifted uneasily. "But why? Watches?" "Because time is memory," Miss Marple said simply, "and memory once buried needs a marker." She reached into her handbag and produced a cracked silver watch. This one was found in the soil beside the hydrangeas. It held a folded strip of paper bearing Clara's final name, Clara Glemson, and the key to a left luggage locker in London. She placed it gently on the table. He meant for someone to find it, but not before she was safe. The contents of the locker, Miss Marple continued, were delivered to the solicitor 2 days before Mr. Gage's death. Letters, photographs, receipts, all documenting Clara's survival and reinvention, her life after she vanished in the war. She paused, but not all of it was dignified. The silence deepened. "It seems Clara fell into difficulty, petty crimes, a brief imprisonment under her new name. Yet Mr. Gage protected her fiercely. The watches, the parcels, the legal arrangements, all designed to ensure her existence remained hidden and her legacy protected." She turned to Mrs. Clemens now, her voice no colder, but firmer. "Which is why your reaction, upon seeing one of those watches unearthed, was not surprise, but dread." Mrs. Clemens did not look up, but her breathing had grown shallow. "You buried more than a memory under the rhododendrons, didn't you?" The confession when it came, did not emerge in protest or collapse, but in quiet surrender. Mrs. Clemens's voice was low, her gaze fixed on her gloved hands. "I received a letter," she said, "weeks ago, from someone in London, a woman who had known Clara in one of those places. She said Clara had spoken of a man who sent her things, watches, letters, a Mr. Gage." She paused. "I thought my daughter had died. I told everyone she had died, and for years I lived with that lie as if it were truth. Then to find she hadn't died at all, that she had simply changed, become someone else, someone who lived by theft and deceit." Her voice wavered. "I couldn't bear it. Not again." "And so," Miss Marple prompted softly, "he'd told me he was rewriting the will, leaving it all to her. He was proud, you see, of her survival. And I thought of what would happen if it all came out. The talk, the shame, what she had become." "So you visited him," Miss Marple concluded gently. "And you brought tea?" She closed her eyes. "It was only a pinch, just enough. I told myself it was mercy, for both of us." The vicar reached for a handkerchief, but Mrs. Clemens shook her head. She looked now not fragile, but empty. "I thought I was protecting her," she said, "and myself, and the village, perhaps, from one more scandal that would stain our tidy little world." "But scandal," Miss Marple replied quietly, "is a thing only feared by those who cannot forgive. Clara did not ask for absolution, nor did she return. She left her name behind so that others might go on in peace." Mrs. Clemens's eyes, dry now, stared at the carpet. "And yet I brought death into the very heart of it." "No," said Miss Marple, "you brought silence. Death was only the consequence." Outside, the church bell rang once, for the hour, or perhaps for reckoning. Edwin Marsh, who had spoken not a word since entering the room, stood with clenched hands. Miss Marple turned to him at last. "You are owed an apology," she said gently, "from the village, from the constable, and perhaps even from those in this room." He said nothing, but his throat moved. "You were not Mr. Gage's enemy," she continued. "You were his companion in silence, bound by your love for a woman long lost to both of you, and it was for that reason he sheltered you, not out of guilt, but shared grief." The doctor, subdued, nodded slowly. "I'll see the charges dropped, at once." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Good." For Mr. Gage's final act was not a descent into madness, but a quiet, deliberate attempt at restoration, not of time, but of dignity. She looked toward the window, where the last of the afternoon sun touched the lawn. "Some stories," she said, "end not with justice, but with understanding, and sometimes that is enough." The lane was quiet in the hour after matins. Sunlight filtered through branches just beginning to green. Miss Marple took her customary walk past Weatherby Cottage, her footsteps soft on the gravel, her pace unhurried. The house looked smaller now, as places often do once the mystery has drained from them. The windows, once curtained and shadowed, were bare. The boots, those old rubber sentinels, were gone, and in their place, undisturbed soil bore the memory of what had once been hidden there. No one came or went. No smoke curled from the chimney. The cottage had reverted to its shell, the whispers having moved on, as villages always do, to the next pot of jam, the next misdelivered letter. Miss Marple paused for a moment, her gloved hands folded neatly. There was no triumph in her eyes, only reflection. What had been resolved lay beneath that soil, as surely as anything planted. Some secrets, she thought, do not die. They simply choose where to rest. It was Lily Wren, naturally, who had thought to plant something there. The vicar's wife mentioned it in passing. The child insisted, dear. Said it felt too empty otherwise. A ring of white snowdrops now blossomed modestly near the garden path, just beside the hydrangeas where the boot had always stood. They nodded in the breeze, neither solemn nor proud, but gently present, as if to honor something they did not need to name. No plaque marked the spot. No one spoke of Clara aloud. But those who passed, including Lily herself, now did so with a quieter step, as if the flowers required permission to bloom untroubled. Miss Marple smiled faintly as she observed them. It was a fitting tribute, not to death but to the delicate persistence of remembrance. For memory, she knew, did not always come in statues or tears. Sometimes it arrived with the first green shoot of spring. That afternoon, over tea with the vicar's wife, Miss Marple stirred her cup thoughtfully before setting the spoon aside. "Funny, isn't it?" she mused. "How memory behaves. Some spend their lives trying to forget, only to find it has anchored them. Others hold on too tightly and end up prisoners of the hour they refuse to release." The vicar's wife nodded, though her reply was gentle and vague. Miss Marple did not expect more. Truth, after all, was not always a thing shared in full. Later, as the evening cooled and the roses leaned into the hush, Miss Marple stood by her own garden gate, looking out across the lane. "I suppose," she said to no one in particular, "that people bury truth the way they bury seeds, some hoping it will die quietly, others knowing it will bloom when the time is right." A soft wind stirred the petals at her feet. She closed the gate behind her and returned to the quiet order of her parlor, where the clock ticked steadily on. "Thank you for staying with us through the watch in the garden boot." A quiet tale of secrets buried not just in soil, but in the hearts of those who carry memory like a hidden weight. At first glance, it was only an old man's death, a stopped watch, a pair of rubber boots in the garden. But behind it all lay a lifetime of silent grief, her daughter lost to war and reinvention, and a mother's unbearable choice to protect the living by silencing the past. In true Miss Marple fashion, the truth did not come crashing in. It crept gently through old records, whispered in forgotten names, and bloomed quietly like the snowdrops left behind. This story reminds us how deeply the past can reach into the present, how time may be measured not in hours. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.